May 7th, 1945. A rail siding outside Dachau, Bavaria. Corporal James Whitmore pressed his ear against the weathered wood of a boxcar door and heard something that made his blood stop. Breathing. Dozens of shallow breaths, barely audible over the wind. The war was over. Hitler dead. The regime collapsed, but the trains kept their secrets. When Whitmore and his squad finally pried open that rusted lock, 9 days after someone had sealed it shut, the smell hit them first. Urine, sweat, decay. Then came the silence. 43 children pressed against the back wall, eyes hollow, lips cracked, not one of them making a sound. The youngest was 3 years old. None of them cried. Before we go further, if you're finding value in these untold stories of World War II, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in Berlin, Boston, or Buenos Aires. Your support helps us keep bringing these forgotten moments to light. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. History matters most when it's remembered together. Whitmore had been in Europe for 18 months. He'd seen Normandy, the Bulge, the camps. He thought he'd seen the worst humanity could offer. But standing in that doorway, staring at 43 silent children who had learned that screaming accomplished nothing, he realized something far more terrifying. The cruelty wasn't just in the killing. It was in the forgetting, in the casual abandonment of lives considered too insignificant to document. These children had no names in the official records, just numbers. Subject 347, Subject 412. And in the final chaos of Germany's collapse, someone had locked them in darkness and walked away. That was the moment Whitmore understood. Evil doesn't always come with intention. Sometimes it comes with indifference. The 45th Infantry Division had rolled through southern Germany like a flood, consuming everything in its path. By early May 1945, resistance had fractured into confusion, soldiers surrendering in groups, civilians fleeing in all directions, entire towns abandoned mid-evacuation. The American advance moved faster than anyone could process, faster than orders could be executed, faster than the collapse itself. Near the small rail depot outside Dachau, abandoned boxcars sat like monuments to a regime that had built its power on railways and logistics. Most stood empty, doors hanging open, their contents looted or burned. Some held crates of documents, medical equipment, things the regime had tried to evacuate before the end. Others held nothing but shadows and the ghosts of what had passed through them. Whitmore had been tasked with clearing the rail yard's standard procedure, checking for booby traps, hidden weapons, anything dangerous left behind. The smell of the nearby camp still clung to his uniform, a smell he knew would never completely wash out. His hands shook when he lit cigarettes now. His dreams were full of faces, but orders were orders, and the work was necessary. He walked through the maze of rusted iron and rotting wood, his rifle slung across his back, exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. 22 years old. From Iowa. He'd aged decades in 3 weeks. Then he heard it faint, almost imagined a scraping sound from inside a car near the end of the line. The boxcar looked like all the others. Weathered wood, rusted hinges, a heavy sliding door sealed with a metal bar. But this one hadn't been opened. The lock was still in place, thick with rust but intact. Whitmore pressed his ear against the wood and heard it again. Movement, breathing, something alive inside. He called for his sergeant, and 3 men gathered at the door, rifles ready. They had found horrors before, mass graves, execution sites, rooms filled with bodies stacked like cordwood. They expected the worst. They always expected the worst now. The metal bar screamed as they pried it loose. The door resisted, warped from 9 days of heat and moisture, then finally surrendered with a sound like splitting bone. Sunlight poured into the darkness, and for a moment no one could see anything. Just the smell rushing out, overwhelming, making grown men turn away and retch. Then their eyes adjusted. Children, dozens of them, pressed against the back wall of the boxcar like animals herded by fire. Their faces were gray in the sudden light, eyes enormous and unblinking. The smallest ones clung to the older ones, silent, trembling, their clothes soaked with waste and sweat. None of them cried. None of them spoke. They just stared at the American soldiers standing in the doorway with expressions that contained no hope, no fear, nothing but the blank endurance of those who had stopped expecting rescue. Whitmore would later tell his wife that he'd never seen anything more terrifying than that silence. Not the artillery barrages, not the bodies in the camps, not the desperate fighting in the Ardennes. Just 43 children who had learned that screaming accomplished nothing. The youngest was a girl they would later identify as Greta Lindemann. She was 3 years old, though malnutrition had made her look younger. She sat in the corner of the boxcar, her hand gripping the shirt of a boy who might have been her brother. Her legs were covered in sores where she'd been sitting in her own waste for 9 days. She didn't look at the soldiers. She looked at nothing, her gaze fixed on some middle distance where nothing could hurt her any more. The oldest was a boy named Werner Hoffman, 13 years old, who had taken responsibility for the younger ones when the adults disappeared. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. His voice was a whisper when he finally spoke in broken English. "Water," he said. Just that one word. Water. Sergeant Bill McKenna was the first to move. He'd grown up on a ranch in Montana, raised 5 younger siblings after his mother died. He climbed into the boxcar slowly, hands visible, speaking in a low voice even though most of the children couldn't understand English. "It's okay," he said. "It's over. You're safe now." None of them moved. They watched him with the wariness of wild things that had been trapped before. McKenna pulled his canteen from his belt and held it out toward Werner. The boy stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to understand what it meant, what the cost might be. Then he reached out with a hand that shook so badly he could barely grip the metal. He drank small sips at first, then deeper, and when he lowered the canteen, tears carved clean lines down his filthy face. That broke something in the Americans. Within minutes, every soldier in the vicinity had converged on the boxcar, bringing water, rations, blankets, anything they could find. The medics arrived and began triaging, checking for broken bones, infections, signs of serious dehydration. Most of the children were too weak to walk. They had to be carried out one by one, carefully, like something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. As the evacuation continued, a private named Eddie Kowalski noticed something carved into the wooden wall of the boxcar. Letters scratched with a fingernail or piece of stone, shallow and uneven. German words. He called over a translator, a Jewish refugee, who'd been assigned to their unit for exactly this kind of situation. The translator stared at the words for a long time before speaking. His voice was flat, emotionless, in the way of someone who'd learned to separate themselves from what they were seeing. "It's a counting system," he said. Someone was marking the days. 9 marks. 9 vertical lines scratched into the wood, each one representing another day locked inside that darkness. Beneath them, more words. The translator read them slowly. "God has forgotten us. We are teaching the little ones to be quiet. It is the only mercy left." No one spoke. The spring air felt suddenly cold despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. Somewhere nearby a bird sang, and the sound seemed obscene in its normalcy. The story began 9 days earlier, in the chaos of the regime's final collapse. The facility where these children had been held, a detention center for children of political prisoners and those deemed enemies of the state, had received evacuation orders on April 30th. The American advance was less than 15 miles away. Everything had to be moved, destroyed, or concealed. The staff had fled during the night. No one wanted to be there when the Americans arrived, to be held accountable for what had happened behind those walls. They took the records with them, burned what they couldn't carry, scattered into the countryside like leaves before a storm, but the children remained. 43 of them, ranging in age from 3 to 13. Some were orphans, parents executed for resistance activities. Others had been taken from families labeled as enemies, communists, intellectuals, anyone who'd questioned the regime too loudly. A low-level administrator named Klaus Brenner had been left behind to handle the final details. He was 56 years old, a bureaucrat who'd spent the war shuffling papers and following orders, never questioning, never involved in the actual violence, but complicit in every single death through his careful documentation and efficient processing. Now he found himself alone with 43 children and no instructions. He decided to load them onto a train. The Americans would find them eventually, but by then he'd be gone, vanished into the mass of refugees clogging every road. It wasn't mercy that motivated him. It was procedure. Document everything. Avoid personal responsibility. Transfer the problem. He herded the children into a boxcar at dawn on May 2nd. They went quietly, trained through years of institutionalization to obey without question. He locked the door from the outside, marked the manifest with their numbers, not names. Just numbers, and left the paperwork on a desk in the abandoned administrative building. Then he walked away. He intended to notify someone. Perhaps he even told himself he would. But the roads were chaos, the communications broken, and by the time he reached the next town, survival had become his only concern. The children in the boxcar slipped from his mind like water through fingers. The train never moved. The rail lines had been bombed, the locomotive commandeered or destroyed. The boxcar sat on a siding, forgotten, while the war's final days played out around it. Inside, Werner Hoffman took charge because someone had to. He organized the younger ones, kept them calm when panic threatened, rationed the single loaf of bread they'd been given until every crumb was gone. He scratched marks into the wall to track the days, partly to maintain some sense of structure, partly because he needed to document what was happening. Even at 13, he understood that someone needed to remember. They had no water except what condensed on the metal walls during the cold nights. They licked the moisture from the wood, pressed their faces against the damp steel. By the 3rd day, the youngest children had stopped crying. By the 5th day, several of them had stopped moving much at all. Werner knew about the camps. He'd been in the facility for 2 years, heard the whispers, seen the transports leaving and never returning. He thought the boxcar was the beginning of the end, that they were being moved to one of the death facilities he'd heard about in fragments of overheard conversation. What he couldn't know was that they'd already been forgotten. Not transported, not processed, just abandoned, left to die slowly in the darkness, because one man had walked away and the system had finally collapsed too completely to follow through on its own cruelty. On the 9th day, when the Americans finally opened the door, Werner was teaching the smallest children to be still. "Quiet," he whispered. "Don't waste energy. Don't cry. Just breathe." The same instructions he'd been giving for days. The only mercy he knew how to provide. The American Field Hospital occupied a commandeered school 5 miles from the rail yard. By nightfall, all 43 children had been examined and placed in clean beds, many sleeping on sheets instead of straw or concrete for the first time. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, an Army nurse from Philadelphia, worked through the night. She'd survived 18 months of triage under fire, but nothing prepared her for children who flinched at kindness, hid food under mattresses, and woke screaming from nameless nightmares. 3-year-old Greta refused to release Werner's shirt, her fingers locked in a painful grip. When nurses tried to separate them, Morrison ordered their beds placed side by side. Some rules mattered less than others. The children ate slowly, fearfully. Several became sick from real food after starvation, forcing Morrison to ration portions, despite how cruel it felt. Their bodies couldn't handle abundance yet. Werner stayed awake beside Greta all night. Morrison brought him soup and watched as he fed Greta first, eating only after she finished, and even then hiding half his portion. "You don't have to do that," Morrison said in careful German. "There's more." Werner met her gaze. "You'll leave," he said. "Everyone does." Morrison sat on the floor beside his bed until dawn so he'd know someone was staying. Within 48 hours, intelligence traced the children back to a detention facility and its abandoned records. Captain David Goldman, a Jewish officer from New York, spent days reading files listing executions, disappearances, and labor assignments numbers without names. Werner's file noted a father executed for treason, a mother institutionalized for grief. Greta's was shorter. Orphan found in bombing rubble, future assigned. Goldman ordered the arrest of Klaus Brenner, the administrator responsible. Brenner was later caught and sentenced. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Recovery was slow. Bodies healed faster than minds. Silence lingered. Nurses relearned trust with them, crying aloud, food requested, adults staying. Progress came in fragments. Laughter, seconds asked for, Greta learning one word, more. By June, the Red Cross began tracing families. Most searches found nothing. Europe was full of orphans. A fragile answer followed. Resettlement. The boxcar children left together, numbers shed, futures uncertain, but finally seen. Winner, now acting as the group's unofficial leader, was given the task of explaining to the younger ones what was happening. They were leaving Germany, going to a place where they'd be safe, where no one would lock them in darkness, where someone would remember their names. Greta clung to his shirt as he spoke, her grip just as tight as it had been in the boxcar. She was 4 years old now, according to the doctor's best guess. She'd learned to speak haltingly, carefully, as if each word might be dangerous. Her first full sentence had been, "Werner won't leave?" He'd promised her then, and he kept promising. "I won't leave you. Not ever." The convoy departed in late June. 43 children, several nurses who'd volunteered to travel with them, and a military escort. They traveled west toward France, where ships waited to carry them further into an uncertain future. At the rail yard where the convoy was staged, Corporal Whitmore stood beside the same boxcar where he'd found them 7 weeks earlier. Someone had already painted over it, preparing it for regular service again. The scratches on the interior wall, Werner's counting marks, those desperate words, were gone, covered with fresh wood paneling. But Whitmore would carry those marks forever. He'd made sketches of the writing before it was erased, copied the German words phonetically in his notebook, even though he couldn't read them. Years later, he'd have them translated properly, frame them in his home in Iowa, show them to his grandchildren. "This," he'd tell them, "is why we fought." The children boarded buses, not boxcars, never boxcars again, and the convoy moved on. Werner sat beside Greta, her head on his shoulder, sleeping without nightmares. Outside, Germany passed by in ruins and empty fields, already rebuilding. He thought of the 9 counting marks he had scratched into wood. 9 days. Once a lifetime. Now a moment inside a larger story. Records show that 39 of the 43 children survived to adulthood. 4 died soon after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Werner Hoffman immigrated to America in 1949, sponsored by a Jewish family in Boston who had lost their own children. He became a social worker, dedicating his life to helping orphans find homes. He did not speak publicly about the boxcar until 1985, when a filmmaker found him through military archives. Greta Lindemann grew up in Israel, became a teacher, and spent her life helping traumatized children. She married late, had 2 sons, and never entered a train car again. Corporal James Whitmore returned to Iowa, raised 4 children, and remained Werner's friend for 50 years. When Whitmore died in 1995, Werner spoke at his funeral. "He saved more than our bodies," Werner said. "He saved our belief that humans could be decent." The boxcar itself was scrapped in 1967, unmarked and forgotten by the rail company. But the children remembered, and the soldiers remembered. In memory, the boxcar became testimony not of cruelty alone, but of resilience. Sergeant Bill McKenna later recalled opening the door, expecting bodies, and finding survivors instead. "Even when systems fail," he said, "something in people refuses to give up." He carried a photograph of the 43 children for the rest of his life. The war ended. The trains stopped. But the memory remains 9 days, 9 marks, 43 children, 1 door opened in time. History sometimes is nothing more than the choice to stop, look inside, and refuse to walk past.